Stabbed in the back. Et tu, Brute, betrayal. And I'm not talking about when Sephiroth burns down Nibelheim or anything like that. Oh, I'm talking about much worse things. Real life video game betrayals. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 13 of the biggest betrayals in video game history. Starting off at number 13, it's the Serenity Now funeral raid. The story starts off with a tragedy. A World of Warcraft player who will go unnamed died of a stroke. Truly awful, but also not the betrayal, obviously. The Players Guild decided to hold an in-game funeral so that the people who knew them in the game could mourn together, and announced the funeral on the server forums. There is one little problem though. The server was a PvP server, meaning players could just attack each other freely. So the players advertising the funeral were intentionally putting themselves at risk. The funeral was going to take place at Winter Spring, which the deceased particularly liked, at a certain time and place. I suppose the organizers just hoped that the better parts of our nature would prevail, and that people would hold off on attacking each other until the funeral event was done. Of course, this is World of Warcraft, not World of Respectcraft. No degeneracy is too great for these nerds, so of course somebody attacked the funeral anyway. The Alliance Guild, that just had no regard for social decency, was called Serenity Now. They saw the potential to get a lot of free kills by attacking the gathering, regardless of the emotional stakes involved. They even posted a high cringe video about it after the fact, as was the style in 2006. It was a huge breach of social etiquette, but Serenity Now didn't actually break any in-game rules. This was a PvP server after all, and they were just doing what they were technically supposed to be doing. Another important thing to keep in mind about this is that it's not like this was some completely unexpected attack. The guild that organized the event were also PvPers. They knew what they were getting into. They knew that posting the funeral on the forums was going to draw attention. And who knows what else they knew. Was there a Serenity Now mole involved in the planning? Who knows? People were arguing about the whole thing for days leading up to the event. I don't even mean in the wake of it. I mean leading up, before. So everybody knew something was going to go down. Still, it's a story that's lived on in World of Warcraft lore. A cowardly attack on a funeral that was dubiously immoral, but absolutely acceptable according to the rules of the game. It's not like it was a permadeath server, everybody just respawned and went about their day afterwards. So while it's easy to describe this event as some kind of epic Red Wedding style ultimate betrayal, it mostly just amounted to be another dumb thing that happened in WoW. Still, I think a pretty good way to start off this list. Moving on to number 12, the EVE Online Spy Caper. What makes EVE different from World of Warcraft is that it's not just the player's time that's on the line. There's real money behind the biggest guilds, or corporations as they're called there. I think EVE Online is really cool because it has literally a real economy in it, and not like, we've got tokens and microtransactions and that means there's an economy. No, there's a functioning economy that is governed by bodies and interfered with by holders of large amounts of power. It's actually really neat. But also, some of the most expensive assets in the game are worth thousands of real life dollars. So losing that stuff isn't just something you can brush off. Losing a ship is real money coming out of your wallet. So the stakes are a lot higher. That's what makes this betrayal, which makes no sense, a betrayal in the truest sense of the word. That's what makes this one so significant. I'm talking about the time a player named The Judge managed to steal an entire holdings of a 4,000 person strong alliance. He took everything, the ships, the money in storage, and an essential space citadel they owned, which he in turn sold off to their rivals. Now keep in mind, this is the game. Nobody's got any recourse for that. They can either go try to take everything back or shut the hell up. Now, there's a whole lot of backstory behind this one, though. Like with anything EVE related, it feels like you're reading a history textbook. They're throwing so many names and organizations at you. But the main two characters of this story are the Judge and the guy who managed to turn him, a guy called Aerith. During an in-person meeting similar to a corporate election, Aerith identified the Judge as a potential candidate to turn to their side. Discussions were conducted out of the game in person where there was no chance of someone monitoring it. They understood that the Judge was unhappy with the current direction of his allies and saw a potential mark. For the judge's part, he knew that Aerith viewed him as a target to exploit, but he also wasn't happy with his current arrangement and went along with the plan. The whole thing sounds like a lot of real cloak and dagger stuff, and that's because it kind of was. It wasn't your basic guild drama. It was a massive coup for Aerith's side. All told, the judge managed to get away with around 1.5 trillion ISK, which is the game's currency, and in real life it was worth around $20,000, like actual US dollars. That is a crazy haul, and one of the most legendary betrayals in EVE Online history. At number 11, Activision betrays the Call of Duty founders. I'm not just talking about MMO players betraying each other for this list. I figured a good place to talk about the many real-life video game betrayals that play out in video game history is, of course, corporations. This particular situation was one of the most sudden and public falling outs. Is that how you say that? Fallings out? Falling out? Whatever. Between the heads of a studio and their publisher in all of gaming history. And in this case, the stakes were impossibly high because they dealt with the future of the Call of Duty franchise. You'd think Activision would do anything to keep Infinity Ward co-founders and Call of Duty creators Jason West and Vince Zampella happy, but instead of rewarding them and their studio for success, Activision fired them. Apparently, they were let go because of quote-unquote insubordination at executive-level meetings. And later, it was revealed that apparently Activision just thought they were going to jump ship to Electronic Arts. So West and Zampella filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Activision, where they claimed that they were let go so Activision wouldn't have to pay out million-dollar bonuses that they would have gotten with the record sales of Modern Warfare 2. The case was eventually resolved out of court, which means Activision was in the wrong, and they admitted it, but they didn't want it on public record, and likely paid these guys a pretty fair amount of money. But unfortunately, because that's how it happened, the results are confidential, so we don't really know. Typically, the bigger party, the one being sued, in a settlement, it usually doesn't go their way, and West was seen leaving the courthouse looking pretty pleased. So, it's highly likely Activision was in the wrong here, and the co-founders got a nice payout, like I said. The whole situation just goes to show how callous Activision can be with their developers, even if you're the goose who laid the golden egg. The guys who gave Activision the thing that keeps Activision going. Call of Duty, the biggest license to print money outside of Grand Theft Auto, and that's still not enough for Activision. I mean, who knows? Maybe they really were insubordinate at some meeting, but who really cares? Does it really warrant a firing? Like, insubordination is a pretty non-specific thing. And I'm just going to go ahead and say this. I've never been in a professional setting that there are no arguments in, because that's partly how some things get done. Like, it's hard for me to imagine these guys walked into a conference room, dropped trow and pinched a loaf off on the table, which I think maybe would warrant a firing. But I think that the conversation, if it even happened, was probably just a heated discussion about making games. The whole situation's really weird. Like, what on earth made Activision flip out on that? It seems like a pretty paranoid move without further context, and we probably don't know the whole story, but we do know the Infinity Ward co-founders got royally betrayed. But in a quick example of how turnabout is fair play, West and Zampella founded Respawn Entertainment under the EA umbrella, exactly what they were paranoid they would do, and these guys seem to have no plan to, but hey, why not? Moving on to number 10, Corrupted Blood's Patient Zero. Everybody knows about the famous Corrupted Blood event from World of Warcraft. It's been recounted many times before on this channel, but the basic story is that back in 2005, there was a newly introduced raid boss called Hacker the Soulflayer. One of this guy's special effects was that he could inflict a debuff called Corrupted Blood on people, and it would spread automatically to any unaffected players nearby. This was designed in a way that it would never naturally escape the raid dungeon. The poison effects of the plague were just too powerful. Of course, it still ended up spreading everywhere, killing low-level players almost instantly, and effectively disabling the entire game until Blizzard was able to put up some kind of a fix. So, how did the plague end up spreading? Well, through the actions of certain malicious players who were using an exploit. So what they were able to do was get their pets to contract the corrupted blood, and then they would put them in a hibernating state so they could leave the dungeon, and then they'd come out with the plague debuff still active. So whoever was patient zero, the person who started the pandemic in the first place, was 100% aware of what they were doing. This person was intentionally spreading the plague for whatever reason. Maybe they just wanted to see what happened, or maybe they just wanted to see the world burn. Nobody knows exactly who's responsible for this quote-unquote pandemic. All we know for sure is that the first major outbreak of the corrupted blood happened on the Archimon server. Even though their identity and motives kind of remain a mystery, I think that the actions of our quote-unquote patient zero amount to a pretty big betrayal. I mean, what else would you call intentionally spreading an infectious disease to your friends and allies? Like, can you imagine during COVID, you had like a friend who came over and you're like, you don't have COVID, right? And they're like, I do have COVID. Ha ha, gotcha. I mean, you don't kill a half a server's population out of loyalty. At number 9, Human Head betrays publisher Ragnarok Games LLC. The release of Rune 2 was a big old disaster. The game, which was highly anticipated by fans of the original Rune, ended up being a big old piece of crap. It was rushed and unfinished, and just one day after the game released, the developers at Human Head announced that they would no longer be supporting the game and that they'd be shutting down. This could have been understandable if the studio just ran out of money, you know, if they really did just completely close up shop, but that's not what actually happened. Instead, Human Head closed and a new studio under Bethesda called Roundhouse Studios opened. So essentially the day of release, the developers of the game pushed out a clearly inferior product and then jumped ship to greener pastures, leaving the game's publisher Ragnarok Games high and dry. These guys weren't big movers and shakers like Bethesda, so releasing a bad game and having the devs split like this ended up being highly damaging for the company. They eventually opened up a lawsuit with Bethesda and the former Human Head Studios, but the last bit of news I've seen about the case was from 2020, so I'm not sure how that got resolved, if it got resolved. Most likely it ended a similar way to the Activision lawsuit, with an out-of-court settlement and non-disclosure agreements for all parties. The thing about this whole situation is the only information we have comes from Ragnarok Studios, who were either preparing for or in the middle of a lawsuit at the time, so we never really got Human Head's perspective in all this. We don't know the circumstances that made Bethesda seem like the right choice at the time, or why they chose to abandon Rune 2. Maybe if we got their story, this whole thing would be perfectly understandable. It's weird that Human Head went back to Bethesda, the same publisher that allegedly killed Prey 2 and nearly drove them out of business. Like, I don't know what made Human Head go back and why. It's just a weird situation. I get bad vibes from it. And number 8, Square dumped Nintendo for Sony. When this happened, oh man, people were just like, what? So yeah, through the original NES and Super NES, Square and Nintendo were pretty much joined at the hip. Where other big Japanese studios like Capcom and Konami were somewhat console agnostic, Square published their games on Nintendo consoles only. Games like Final Fantasy VI, Secret of Mana, and Chrono Trigger, all-time classics, huge games whose legacy has survived to this very day, they were synonymous with Super Nintendo. To say they were some of the biggest sellers of the time would be, a pretty straightforwardly true statement. They were a lot of people's first Nintendo games. They brought people to those systems. It seemed like a partnership that would never end, at least until the Nintendo 64 came around. So Square wanted to make their games bigger and more, I guess for lack of a better word, cinematic, although really no games were cinematic at this time. And Nintendo wanted to stick to the cartridge format for their next console. This was a restrictive format in terms of storage, but it ended up working out very well for games like Mario 64 and Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. That being said, early tests from Square made it pretty obvious that Nintendo 64 hardware wasn't going to be a good fit for the direction Square wanted to go with their next game. The cartridges just didn't have storage for really long, story-heavy games, particularly with cinematics, which was something they wanted to use. And if they really wanted to do that, to innovate with their RPGs, they needed a disc-based system that had much larger storage. Like even CDs, the biggest storage medium that was portable and usable at the time, wasn't big enough to put what they wanted to do on a single CD. Like their games were multiple CDs back when they came out. And in hindsight, Square switching over to PlayStation was the right move. But if you were a Nintendo fan way back, this was the ultimate betrayal. Some people bought Nintendo 64s just because they wanted the next Final Fantasy game, which they assumed would appear on that console. Gaming news wasn't as easy to access back then, so nobody knew the behind-the-scenes deal-making always going on in the industry, so a lot of people just assumed through reputation that Square games would continue to appear on Nintendo consoles, which is a reasonable assumption. This is back in the day when that's kind of what a brand meant. It didn't mean a lifestyle and a fandom and products. It meant what you could basically expect from that thing. Now, Nintendo actually was pretty gracious about it. They displayed a ton of understanding about the arrangement by wishing the developers of Final Fantasy VII a goodbye and a good luck. We don't know how Nintendo exactly actually felt about it, but publicly, they put on a pretty good face. Now, to be fair, it's not like Nintendo did need them. So who betrayed who exactly? Square. It was Square. And number 7 is the easiest EVE Online heist. We've brought this game up during this list already. That one was kind of insane. And, a lot of betrayals, particularly in EVE Online, can take days, months, even years of careful and meticulous planning. They required dozens of people coordinating together, legions of spies, and high-stakes negotiations. This betrayal is very different. All it took was 2 clever players and a particularly inattentive corporation. The job was easy, but the rewards were insane. They claimed to have gotten away with about 2.23 trillion ISK, about $22,000 in real-world cash, and all it took was a fake account and one other guy willing to make it happen. So here's what went down. 2 players joined the Event Horizon Expeditionaires Corporation. I really hate their name. It is difficult to read for me, but that's not the important part. Really, they were quite large. They had a group with 299 members and a whole ton of resources. One applied early enough to get enough corporate shares that they could force a vote for a new CEO. Both guys voted to make the infiltrator the new CEO, and then they waited. All it takes is a flat majority to win a vote, and they end after 3 days, so as long as nobody else votes, even 2 votes is enough to win, and that's exactly what happened. So the corporation had a new CEO who immediately cleared out the coffers, transferred ownership of the ships to himself, and then bailed with the loot. If just 2 other people had logged in and voted during those 3 days, the scheme would have never worked, but the group was asleep at the wheel and left an opening for these guys to come in and rob the corporation blind. Now, again, that's the game in EVE Online. That's kind of the type of thing that you're trying to do in that game, but they didn't just by the rules of the game do this legally, but they did it by the in-world rules. Like, in no way was this an undemocratic coup. It was highway robbery, but it wasn't technically a robbery. I mean, it was very much a robbery. They stole everything. It's just that this is the most democratic betrayal on the list. 1 person, 1 vote. 2 people, 2 votes. That's all the people that voted. And number 6, the race to unlock a raid in WoW Classic leads to betrayal. Opening the gates of Encourage was supposed to be a group effort. To unlock the gate, it requires both the Horde and Alliance to work together and gather resources, far more than any one person is capable of doing. The entire event is meant to be this big server-wide cooperative action. It's supposed to see the warring factions come together for a common goal, but one guild did not want this. They wanted to be the first to open the gate at any cost. Now, getting first isn't just about prestige here. You also get an exclusive mount and a special title that can only be obtained if you're the one to craft the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. And then you use it to ring the gong, which opens the gate and triggers the 10-hour war where the gate opens and the monsters come flooding for 10 hours straight before stopping. You gotta be the first. Enter the guild Grizzly from the Sulphurous server. These guys clearly wanted to be the first to ring the bell. They were responsible for collecting the vast majority of the resources needed to complete the first step, and when it came time to build the scepter, they were ready. This is all fine. The whole point of this event is for players to work together, but also be in competition with one another, but allegedly Grizzly took things a little too far. They didn't just want to be first, they were actively getting in the way of other players' progress. They would lock down the world bosses who dropped resources for the scepter, and other players couldn't progress in their quest, which is super annoying, but that's far from the worst of it. According to the player Souffle, their guild managed to break through Grizzly's defenses, but just as they were about to progress into the zone and killed the raid boss, they were disconnected. The account had been banned. So everything up till this point is your usual rivalry stuff, maybe taken a little too far, but falsely reporting players just so your guild is the first to get a mount and a title is taking things way too far. You might be wondering how that's possible, but people claim that if a guild files enough in-game false reports, it sets off an automatic report system, which automatically bans somebody basically shooting first and asking questions later. It would not be the only game, nor the only online service that does this, but I'll say it's not really ever proven to be possible, and one of Blizzard's community managers came forward to say that the ban was real, but they never said why. They went on to say that there were false reports as well, and that those players had been punished, so it's possible someone in Grizzly had some dirt on Souffle, or maybe it's just a big coincidence, but the accusations of betrayal got thrown around either way. Either way, later, Souffle was able to complete the scepter, and Grizzly's backhanded tactics blew up in their own faces because so many of their players got banned for filing false reports. They were so low on members they were unable to keep up. Grizzly's problems didn't end there either. Once the gates unlocked and the 10-hour war started, players worked to make it so Grizzly couldn't participate at all, actively locking them out of the content just because everyone hated them now. That's a betrayal that backfired, and pretty badly. Moving on to number 5, Nintendo betraying Sony on the big stage. This is one of the all-time great corporate tales of betrayal that ended with lasting ramifications for the entire games industry. You probably heard something about this one at some point, but in the early 90s, Nintendo was thinking about making a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo similar to the Famicom disk drive that added a floppy disk to that console, which, by the way, we never did see in the United States, presumably because the Nintendo and the Famicom are very different physically speaking and not really that necessary in terms of what Nintendo wanted to do with the NES. Now, the CD format offered a lot of possibilities for game makers. Like, think about the Nintendo and Square situation that we just talked about a moment ago, and think about how different that would have turned out had Nintendo actually built some kind of commitment towards the CD format a generation prior to the Nintendo 64. Imagine if Square was dealing with a Nintendo that was providing to them a format with storage far beyond that of a cartridge-based game. Now, the entire project was started by a Sony engineer named Ken Kuroragi, who was eventually called the father of PlayStation. He ended up convincing Nintendo of the potential of such a system. It could have been the partnership of a lifetime, but from the start, Nintendo was skeptical. They were used to having innovation come from inside the house, but this was an outsider from a potential rival coming into their business, learning their methods and expertise, offering them something they're not even sure they want. Now, keep in mind, this isn't the tail end of the 16-bit generation. It's 1990. 3D was mostly just seen as a possibility, and the CD format hadn't fully caught on. Nintendo was, and honestly still is, a fairly conservative company when it comes to chasing cutting-edge technological innovation. As you know, they prefer to use tried and tested components and do their own thing from there. A Sony/Nintendo partnership could have been amazing, but right from the start there was a friction. Nintendo just didn't trust their motives and came to believe that Kuroragi was just using the project to learn how consoles are made so they could turn around and use that knowledge to make their own system. I mean, not the most far-fetched thing to consider regarding the situation, but long story short, Nintendo didn't trust Sony, so they did something about it. At the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, Sony announced their partnership with Nintendo and showed off the Nintendo PlayStation, and it would have been the biggest announcement of the show, but just one day later, Nintendo went on stage to announce they were working with Philips, a different electronics company, instead. The company shut Sony out in about as public a way as is possible. That's the kind of thing to do when you want to permanently burn bridges, and it's something you almost never see in this business because, well, it's kind of a carefully balanced ecosystem, and you could throw things off pretty easily by pulling a Spider-Man 3 Peter Parker and putting some dirt in somebody's eyes. And in all honesty, as unstable as people see the industry right now, that was a time when they had just recovered from the biggest video game crash ever. You wouldn't think to see this type of a shakeup, but we did. And Sony was so incensed that they obviously went on to make their own console, which they were probably going to do anyway. Like, Nintendo probably wasn't wrong per se. It's just maybe they could have prevented it by playing nice with Sony. Still, you know the result. It's called the PlayStation. So Nintendo kind of inadvertently created their own biggest rival, but hey, at least we got the Philips CDI Nintendo games out of it. You know, the all-time classics like Link Faces of Evil and The Wand of Gamelon. I know I sound sarcastic, but I am actually happy those exist because those animations are the funniest thing of all time. But in terms of Zelda games, they're terrible. Smart move, Nintendo. Totally worth it. At number 4 is the Falador Massacre. Along with WoW's Corrupted Blood event, RuneScape has had its own bloodbath known as the, stop me if you know it, Falador Massacre, or more broadly, the 666 glitch. So in RuneScape, players can only fight each other in specific places, but there was a bug that allowed some players to engage in combat even outside these designated zones. It all started with a house party hosted by a guy named Cursed You, who was the first player to reach level 99 in construction, and to celebrate this milestone, he had a big virtual party. The place was crowded. It was so crowded that the server load was too much and everyone got booted out of the house. For most players, nothing changed, but for a few who were in the middle of PvP when the server hiccup happened, they found that they were still in combat mode, even in places that would normally be impossible. Now, did these players do the mature and honorable thing, logging out of the games, or informing a mod about the bug? No, of course not. A lot of them went on killing sprees in the most crowded cities in the game. Only lasted about an hour, but the damage was done. A lot of players permanently losing all of their stuff. It's PvP rules, even though the bug made it so that if you're not affected by it, you couldn't even fight back. So basically, a bunch of people were completely screwed. The affected players, on the other hand, did get banned for their pointless betrayal of everyone around them, and even the guy who hosted the party ate a ban, but for unrelated reasons. It's one of those stories that's kind of fun to read about in hindsight, but if you were one of the players that got killed, you were probably pissed. Moving on to number 3, it's the death of Lord British. Ultima Online holds a special place in the history of MMOs. It looks archaic now, but it was really important to the evolution of multiplayer gaming and the internet in general. There's a lot of stories of crazy stuff happening in this game because it was totally a free-for-all, like in every way. In Ultima Online, almost anything was possible, even killing someone who is supposed to be unkillable. If you don't know, Lord British is the alter ego of Ultima creator Richard Garriott. It was his nickname, but it was also his character in the world of Ultima. He was the king of Britannia and a central character in the universe. So when he appeared in the online game, he of course was Lord British, both the in-game king of the world and the celebrity game designer behind the creation of the entire world. He was kind of a big deal, basically. During a stress test before the game came out, Lord British appeared to greet people and celebrate the official launch, which would be happening soon. And during this event, an enterprising thief named Rains noticed the lack of castle guards around, most likely removed to account for the large group of players gathering outside. Rains had a fireball spell and just for the fun of it, decided to use it against Lord British. On any other day, nothing would happen. Lord British was supposed to have a flag set to on that would make him invulnerable to damage, but a server reset had happened and the devs forgot to turn the flag back on, so Lord British was assassinated in front of everyone. The dev response was swift and brutal. They summoned 4 demons who rampaged through the crowd, but the assassin managed to sneak away in all the chaos, so all they really managed to do was ruin the games of a lot of players minding their own business while the actual killer got away scot-free. Now, Ultima Online is another old school MMO where if you die, you drop everything. So a lot of players permanently lost their entire inventories to these demons and were never compensated for it. It's a funny story all around, but it probably sucked for people who were just there to see Lord British. As for Reigns, they were eventually permabanned, but for using exploits, not for killing Lord British. At least that's what the devs claim. Moving on to number 2, it's Disco Elysium's creators betrayed in a sketchy business takeover. This one just sucks straight up. One of the most interesting and unique games of the past few years is Disco Elysium, an investigation RPG that's way weirder and more interesting than its description makes it sound. It's a cool game that got a lot of acclaim at the time, and for a little while it seemed like the future was very bright for these guys. But back in 2022, the studio posted a message saying the lead writer and developer on the project were fired from the studio, along with another writer and art director. It can't be understated how devastating these losses are to whatever future game they're making. The writing and the art is what defines Disco Elysium, so losing the central creatives behind the project but trying to keep the company going just seems bizarre. There is a lot of he said, she said going on about what happened, and both sides have aired their grievances trying to paint the other side as bad guys. The whole situation is made even more confusing because of all the entities involved. There's Zay-Um, the dev studio that made the game, and also Zay-Um, the countercultural artistic movement, and they're both kind of the same thing, but also, I have to imagine, at least legally not the same thing, but also kind of not in other ways as well. The creator's been accused of creating a toxic work environment, so they're not totally in the clear here, and I can buy that. The guy seems like a capital A artist, and I mean, that's kind of what you get with that type of personality, but I'm still inclined to side with him over the sketchy investors who have taken over the business, pushing out the creatives behind it, and they're trying to milk the popularity of the game for all it's worth. Nobody really knows much about the Estonian firm that took over, but their behavior in all this has been extremely sketchy and potentially fraudulent. That's what the creator who was forced out thinks, at least. They filed a lawsuit against the company back in 2022, and the results still remain a mystery. There are some things we do know, however, and they seem pretty damning. There's a lot of different bodies involved, including a convicted criminal and controversial Estonian banker who's believed to be the mastermind behind the entire scheme. But basically what happened is the original owner of the studio wanted to sell, so they approached another businessman to try. To do this, they devised a scheme where the buyer would purchase some concept art from the studio, which was given to them for just $1, and they'd sell it back to the studio for £4.8 million, which just so happens to be the amount the former owner wanted to sell his stake in the company for. The developers had no idea about this scheme and weren't businessmen, so they didn't know what was going on, and the new owners pushed their way in, demoted the main developers, and quickly tried to sell the company to a major game studio to turn a profit. That was the plan, but the original head writer still had some creative control over Disco Elysium and was able to successfully block the sale of any IP rights. So the scheme was both possibly criminal and extremely stupid, which tracks for this kind of a story. These guys might know finance, but they do not know dick about the video game industry, and it's a sad story. It's unfortunately just about some finance ghouls gutting a promising developer in an attempt to strip mine any value out of it as quickly as possible. At least that's not what happened entirely, but I'd rather never get another game in the series with these guys running it. And finally, at number 1, a max level raiding team wiped out in the ultimate troll move. Raiding in WoW Classic's hardcore mode is no joke. Just one slip up and your entire party is dead. Permanently speaking, the character gets deleted and that is the end. So sorry pal, better luck next time. You'd think raiding in such a high stakes environment would make players extra careful about just who they bring along, but apparently a WoW Classic troll named Tiny Violin, 69, managed to slip through the cracks. He already had a reputation and apparently had been banned multiple times in the past, but this particular raid group decided to give him a second chance. Things went smoothly for a while. They raided together frequently for over a year, and Tiny Violin never did anything. But on one fateful night during the Four Horsemen raid boss, something in him snapped. Was it the culmination of a long-term infiltration plan? Was it a momentary lapse in judgment? Was it a snap decision? Was he mad at somebody? I don't know, but the troll saw an opportunity to do his thing, and he did it. Here's the thing, Tiny Violin wasn't just another cog in the raid, he was the main tank. That's an extremely important role that requires constant focus, so this guy was playing the game straight down the middle for months and doing well enough to become a trusted member of the group, only to throw it away one day on a whim. He moved the positioning, got things screwed up, and everyone started to get killed by the raid boss. When the smoke cleared, 36 players were dead and only 2 managed to survive. The raid group was basically decimated, and it would take weeks of non-stop gameplay to get everybody raid ready again. For Tiny Violin's part, he claims it was just an accident, and who knows, maybe it was. But his history as a troll paints a different story. Some people love this guy, a lot of people hate him, but all I care about is that it makes for one hell of a story to end this list on. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on GameRanx.